Everybody, glad you're here. Steve back, and we're going to go over a neat little node setup here. It involves proximity and it involves raycasting, and we can use a color attribute to kind of produce this nice reflective gradient effect. All right, let's get started. All right, guys, let's do this. So Shift A, drop in anything you want, doesn't matter, and click New in the Geometry Nodes workspace. And we can go ahead and cut that off. You could delete this if you want. Now, it's maybe good practice to keep it around just in case you want it or need it, but if you really want, you can always grab another one and it's going to point directly to the mesh you just created, but we don't need it, so I'm going to delete it. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to distribute some mesh on some points. We're going to use proximity, and we're going to make those points kind of react to our proximity object. So what we're going to need is a mesh to points, all right? And we can tag this in. And we don't have any points yet, so we're going to need something from here. And what we would use, which makes more sense than anything else, would be a grid. And the grid is something we can, change the size of. It's basically like putting a plane in, and each one of these are the subdivision levels, and then you can kind of increase or decrease that however you see fit. I'm going to keep it real simple and put around 10 vertices. The size can be something like 3, doesn't have to be too much. That way we just have enough area here so we can have a nice reaction. You could bring it up to 5 too if you wanted to, whatever you want to do. And then even so, bring these up to like 20. So it doesn't really matter. But also make sure to create yourself a nice save point so that way you have your work and you don't get messed up. Now, next thing we're going to want to do is put something on each one of these points to react with the proximity object and the proximity node. So in order to do that, we could put in an instance on points. Now, kind of recommend this, but you could do whatever you want. The mesh primitives, something like the cone, gives you a lot of control. So you have the vertice count, the segment count, and the fill, the radius for the top, the bottom. So you have a lot of control over the mesh. So I'll tag that in. And the depth is automatically set to 2, and we really don't need that set to 2. So I can bring that to something like there, and the bottom radius is set to like 1 meter. That's kind of crazy, don't want that. And then the top radius I could kind of bring out just a touch. That's why I like this one, because you can model it out just in a few steps. So what we could do though is Control Shift and right click and drop in a join geometry, and at some point they'll get that fixed where it actually shows up. It's almost the same amount of time to get it right, and I'll create a little save point. So now I've got the mesh, or we have our mesh. I'm going to go ahead and join the original. So we have the plane, we have our grid underneath here, and what we want to do now is let's drop in a proximity node. And geometry proximity is pretty powerful. You can do a lot with it. I'm just going to collapse the cone and put this geometry proximity right here, because this is where we're going to need it the most. And what we want to do is get the distance to work inside of the scale, but the distance value is a float, and this is a vector denoted by the X, Y, and Z. You don't have that. You've got a gray field socket here, and you've got the purple, which denotes the vector. So it's super easy. Just select these and hit G and X. You can move these over nice and even if you want. You can hit A for all, and you could scale these, or I'll just hit S and Y and kind of scale them on the Y. Give myself a little bit of room to work with, and move this one back up, and move that one back up. All right, so let's pull the scale out, and what we can do is type in combine XYZ. And you'll see in just a moment why I like using a mesh primitive inside of geometry nodes a lot more than just adding a regular mesh over here in the viewport. So I'll plug the distance into the Z. Okay, these are set to 0, so you won't actually see anything. On the X and Y, which would be like left and right respectively, like the green line's Y, the red line is X axis. So if you tag these with 1, you'll see your proximity start up. Looks kind of cool, but we can come in here under the cone and we can change the radius on the top and the radius on the bottom. And if it's kind of clipping or not really looking too good, like it comes in like that, you just gotta change it because they're instances. So we can bring the depth down, all kind of fun stuff, and just kind of get it basically wherever you want it. And now if you grab your proximity, you'll see that we're able to kind of get in here and make some of these disappear with that proximity. So I don't like how that my proximity object isn't really making those go completely negative or disappear. So right here between the scale and the combine, I'm going to type in vector and grab a vector math node and drop it in. Now this is set to add, so really it almost doesn't matter. You can leave this on add and go negative, and it will start to disappear the instances in that area. Or you can go to subtract and then go somewhere to the positive. It's literally the same exact effect. All right, so we've got that. Good job. The next thing we could actually do, and this will be based on the instances on points. We're going to tag something in here. Shift-A-S, let's type in Raycast and grab a Raycasting node. Now the Raycasting node has a lot of cool options on it. It's got an is hit position, hit normal, hit distance, attribute. It needs a target geometry. So first and foremost, we can bring the original proximity object as the target. The is hit can go into the selection of the instances, so it's going to actually affect the instances. Now we have nothing between these two to modify this and get those to show up the way we want. So what we're going to do is Shift-A-S, type in scale, get a scale elements node, and just drop that in right here. Now if you bring this back up, you're now controlling the proximity with a raycast, which is super cool. And so now we can literally just affect this in that one area, however you want to do it. Bring the depth up to make it more pronounced, bring the scale out, touch more, and there you go. All right, let's do a little bit of house cleaning. I'm just going to box select some of this right here and hit Control J, and then I can hit G to kind of move this down. I can grab the outline of my frame box here. You can also Shift-A-S, type in frame, and you'll get a little frame here. You can drop stuff in old school if you want. Control J works nicely. So hit F2, and I'll just call this my proximity center. Hit enter. I'm gonna hit N, grab the N panel, go up here to node, click color, put a nice color on it, drop down the properties here and bring up the label size so you can actually see it. And I'll create a nice little save point and come back out. Now there are some more things we can do to adjust this, because our proximity still is like still showing a little bit. Now that's due to the raycast at this point, and so we have ray length, and there's rays being shot at this. Let's come in here and bring the ray length down. Let's bring it down to like 3. And now from here, you can actually get a true proximity, if you will, because previously it really wasn't a proximity. It was just kind of reacting with the node setup that we had. And so you can kind of make this go this way, and then you've got to scale on the outside. And when you scale the outside, you are going to need to adjust your ray length back up just a little bit, because now you're dragging everything back in. But that looks pretty cool. And as you move this, the rays are going to come in or go. So you got a lot of adjustments you can make. This would be pretty cool. And we can just do a group input and tag this in and bring the ray output here. Bring the scale output here. Come over to the geometry nodes workspace and pin this. So now I'll have a couple of values I can just use outside of the node, which makes a lot of sense. I'll change my object if I want to. Looks good. All right, guys, let's finish up and move over to the shader editor. And let's move over to the shading workspace. But before we go to the shader editor, let's throw in a store named attribute right here. And I actually want to realize the instances as well. It's going to help clean things up. We're going to store an attribute based on the proximity distance, so we can tag that into the value of the store named attribute. We'll just call this hit, because that's how it's going to be for the Raycast. I'll create a new node, a new material node, and I want to just rename this one so I can find it real easy. And I'm going to rename this, let's just call it hit material, so it's a little bit different but easy to find. And now right here after the cone, let's put in a transform geometry, because we're going to need to transform the geometry here based on an attribute. So let's put in an attribute statistic right here, and I want to use the mesh on points to affect that. So I'm going to connect the points to the geometry here. And now we're going to be, and let's close the cone, we're going to be tagging in a float value from our attribute statistic, because it's a float, into a vector. So what we're going to do is transform this. So let's type in vector, and it's intuitive, so you can just hit S and it should come up like SC scale. Boom. So now we can do is we can tag the minimum into the vector here, and let's set this value to -1. And what this is going to do is transform the material based on the transform of the geometry, and it's going to be powered by the proximity. All right, so let's jump over to the shader editor. And with the material that we have here, the hit material, we got a basic principal BSDF, that's fine. What we can do is type in mix shader, not mix shader, and what we'll do is we'll just copy another principal BSDF right here and tag this in. And let's grab an attribute. And this is a little bit different, but it's about the same thing. And what we want to do is type in hit for the attribute. Now that's going to be the store named attribute, what that goes for. And the factor here can go into the factor here. And now these are both white, so let's change this. One of these can go red, one of these can go purple. And now I'm going to go back over to the geometry nodes workspace, grab this. Now I didn't actually set any materials, so I'm going to grab these and hit H to hide them and G to kind of move them down. And I'll grab the cone here, and I want to put in a set material node. And now I'm going to grab my hit material. And now that I've got the hit material in here, you can see it's showing up nicely. And nothing is actually happening just yet. So let's go ahead and let's grab this Raycast is hit. I'm going to shift right click and kind of move this over just a touch. And that way we kind of see where it's going, keep things nice and clean. You can see that is going into the instance on points. And I would take the distance and plug that in to the store named attribute, so that way I could get the effect. But since I'm using the Raycast, I'm going to actually need to tag this in with the Raycast. And once I've done that, you'll see I'll get this nice little gradient effect going on, which isn't too bad. And so that will give you a little bit of a change in the color. So right here, after the geometry proximity, let's get some more control. And let's shift a S, let's type in a map range, and we'll just drop in the map range node. And I love how now everything will shift like this. Map range, like in some instances, will end up like way over here whenever you are using the 3.6, and the 4.0 is real bad about it. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that. The 3.6.1 release candidate though. It's just kind of like I've got multiple copies of Blender open, so my regular 3.6 LTS is kind of indisposed at the moment. Now what we're going to do is we're going to map the proximity from 0 to 1. So the value of that map range is based on our proximity, just tied in with our Raycast. And we want to bring this minimum and maximum up to wherever you are going to want it. And it's going to kind of be based on preference. But if you have the minimum set to like 5 or so and you have the maximum set to 0, you'll get a different effect, obviously. And the color will kind of change. Also, it's going to be pretty big deal about the rays, because we're using a Raycast node. You're not going to get the same effect unless you change the rays. So the more you change this, the more you'll see the color gradients. You're just going to have to play with it. And if you want the exact opposite effect, and we can actually we can chop that. We don't really have to have that on there, just you kind of see it without anything else. If you want the exact opposite effect, you just take the map range, you put this one to 0 and put this one to 5-ish, and you'll have a nice little dip in the geometry as you go. And it'll kind of change colors. It's not too effective, but the rays are going to kind of cast and change how the color scheme works as well. So you end up with a little bit more of a gradient, but that's pretty good. Now we can do is go back over to the shader editor and find out wherever that thing went. I think I've got to bring back, there we go, just click on the cone. And what we can do is we can kind of maybe line these principal BSDFs up. All I need is this yellow material color socket. So I'll drop in a color ramp and I'll set this up with like 5 colors, and I'll just take this into ease so it eases it, which will kind of give it a little bit more of a smooth fall off. And then I want to take this and distribute stops evenly, at least for now. And so I'll grab the color here and we'll change the color, something like orange. Kind of doesn't matter, I can leave a whitish gray one in there, and we'll change one of these to blue just so we get a nice spectrum of colors, and you can kind of see how it goes. So we got a gray to white, gray, blah, blah, all that good stuff. So I'm going to tag this in, and this is going to give us that neater gradient effect. I can Shift D copy this, G and Y, bring it down perfectly. And before I tag this in, I want to actually flip this color ramp so the color is in the opposite direction. And then we'll end up with the wrong thing. Why is that doing that? Let's see. So probably it's just not, it's not mapped. So let's pull out a mapping vector node, and this is just vector to factor. It's perfectly fine in this instance, if you will. And then I use the vector output here and type in COOR and get a texture coordinate. Now we could play around with generated. At this point, doesn't really matter. I prefer to go to object, and you got that actual procedural effect where you can, we should be able to shift these colors back and forth, kind of play around with the scale of said colors. So there you go, guys. That's about it. I'm not going to do any more with this one. May come back with another Raycast because there's really just so much you can actually do with it. I'll jump back over to the geometry nodes editor, and I guess we can go ahead and tag that back in. Maybe not like that. Let's tag this into the join. There we go. So I just tagged in the grid to the main join geometry right here. All right, that's it. Appreciate you guys watching. I'll see y'all in the next tutorial. Anytime you want, you can grab these if you followed along, and you can kind of change basically everything. You've got the mapping node. So if you wanted to shift this once again and get a really cool effect, the Raycast really does provide a lot. And so you got a nice color change there. You can maybe add some glossiness to that and a bunch of other things and make it look really cool. See you guys in the next tutorial lesson.